a NATO ally is threatened, not by an enemy, but by its closest partner. Borders are no longer fixed. They are optional. And a land of just 57,000 people is discussed the way companies discuss oil fields, quietly, coldly, strategically. I'm Fareed Zakaria. What's happening around Greenland is not a joke. It's not a tweet storm. It's a warning. When an American president says the United States needs Greenland, when he refuses to rule out force, and when his aides say calmly that nobody's going to fight the US, that is not diplomacy. That is power speaking without restraint. If rules still matter to you, if alliances still mean something, if small nations deserve a voice, then this story is about you. Stay with me. Because to understand why Greenland suddenly matters so much, we must step back and examine how power is changing in our world. At first glance, this looks simple. The United States wants Greenland. Europe says no, but that reading misses the real story. This is not just about territory. It is about who decides. Greenland is a semi-autonomous region. Its people govern themselves. Denmark handles defense and foreign policy. And yet, suddenly, their future is discussed elsewhere. In Washington, without them, the United States frames this as security, Arctic defense, strategic location, critical minerals. Europe frames it differently. Sovereignty, territorial integrity, international law. Both sides claim stability. Both claim responsibility. But only one side is talking about force. This is where the tension lives. Between rules and power, between alliances and hierarchy, between what the world says it believes and what it is willing to tolerate. To understand how we arrived here, we have to look backward at history, at precedent, and at a system that has been quietly changing for years. To understand this moment, we have to go back, not to Greenland, but to the system around it. Since the end of World War II, global order has rested on one core idea. Borders should not be changed by force. Power would be restrained by rules, and alliances would protect the small from the strong. NATO was built on that promise. An attack on one would be an attack on all. But systems do not collapse overnight. They erode. Over time, power began to speak more loudly than law. Interventions became normal. Exceptions multiplied. Then came a signal. The United States sent elite forces into Venezuela. They seized President Nicolas Maduro and announced they would run the country for an unspecified period. The message was unmistakable. If the US decides something is necessary, rules can wait. That moment changed the context. Greenland was no longer just a distant Arctic territory. It became part of a pattern. And once patterns form, the next crisis is never far behind. Because soon words would turn sharper and signals would become impossible to ignore. Then came the moment when tension turned real. Not through troops, but through signals. A day after the US operation in Venezuela, a map of Greenland appeared online, painted in the colors of the American flag, stamped with one word, soon. It wasn't official policy, but it didn't need to be, because signals matter, especially when they come from people close to power. Soon after, the message hardened. A senior White House aide said it plainly. It was the formal position of the US government that Greenland should be American. No ambiguity, no diplomacy. And when asked about force, the answer was chilling in its confidence. Nobody's going to fight the US over Greenland. This was the first real crisis, not because shots were fired, but because a line was crossed. When force is implied, even casually, rules begin to weaken. If this feels unsettling, it should, because history shows us that moments like this rarely stay symbolic for long. And once power learns it can speak this way, it rarely stops. Which brings us to the deeper question. What is really driving this push? Beneath the rhetoric, there is a system at work. This is not about impulse. It is about structure. The United States sees itself as the central pillar of NATO, its strongest military, its ultimate guarantor. From that position, a dangerous logic can emerge. If America protects the alliance, then America decides what protection requires. Greenland sits at the center of that logic. Its location matters, the Arctic matters, control matters, and when security is framed as necessity, choice disappears. This is how power justifies expansion. Not with conquest, but with protection. Europe hears something different. They hear a challenge to sovereignty, to borders, to the idea that allies are equals. That is why 7 European nations spoke together, not to provoke, but to draw a boundary. Security, they said, must be collective, not imposed, and it must respect international law. 2 worldviews now collide. One sees order as rules shared by many. The other sees order as stability enforced by one. History tells us what happens when those views diverge. Because systems built on imbalance always create pressure. And pressure always looks for release. The next crisis would make that clear. The second crisis did not begin with a threat. It began with fear. Denmark's prime minister said something extraordinary. If the United States attacked Greenland, she warned, NATO would be finished. That was not rhetoric. It was a diagnosis, because NATO is built on trust. And trust cannot survive coercion. Around Europe, the response was swift. 7 nations spoke with one voice. The United Kingdom in France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, Denmark. Their message was careful but firm. Arctic security matters. Yes, but it must be achieved together. And it must respect sovereignty, territorial integrity, inviolable borders. This was no longer a bilateral dispute. It was a test of the alliance itself. If the strongest member can threaten the weakest, what does mutual defense really mean? That question hangs over every capital, quietly, uneasily, because alliances do not collapse in explosions. They fracture in moments like this. And when that happens, the consequences are not abstract. They land on ordinary people. Which brings us to those who have the least power and the most to lose. Now, let's talk about you. Because when great powers argue, it is ordinary people who feel the weight. If you live in Greenland, this is not strategy. It is anxiety. You hear leaders speak about your home as if it were empty space, as if history began yesterday. You hear jokes, maps, threats wrapped in confidence, and suddenly, the future feels fragile. You wonder what comes next, whether words turn into pressure, whether pressure turns into force. One young Inuit man said it plainly. It was terrifying to hear the leader of the free world laugh and talk about Greenland as something to claim because this land already has a name, Kalalit Nunat, the land of the Greenlandic people. If this story unsettles you, that reaction matters, because empathy is not weakness. It is the moral signal that tells us when power has gone too far. Pay attention to that feeling, share this story, talk about it, because silence is how these moments pass unnoticed. And when they do, they reshape the world quietly. But Greenland is not alone. What happens here reaches far beyond the Arctic. What happens in Greenland does not stay in Greenland. The world is watching. Small states see a warning. If borders can be questioned here, they can be questioned anywhere. Allies take notes. So do rivals. Because if sovereignty bends inside NATO, it weakens everywhere else. The Arctic is not isolated. It is connected to global power lines. Control there affects trade routes, military balance, access to critical resources, and when one power claims necessity, others will follow. This is how norms erode, not through sudden collapse, but through repetition. One exception becomes a precedent. One precedent becomes permission. Europe understands this. That is why its leaders spoke together. They did not just defend Denmark. They defended a principle. That security must be shared. That borders matter. That law still has meaning. Because once the rules stop applying to the powerful, they stop protecting the weak. The world has seen this movie before, and it never ends well. Which leaves us with the hardest question of all. What comes next? The answer is not certain, but the paths ahead are becoming clearer. From here, 3 futures are possible. The first is restraint. The United States steps back. Rhetoric cools. Greenland's future is discussed with Greenland. Security is handled collectively through NATO. Rules hold. Trust survives. This is the best outcome. But it requires something rare. Self-limitation by the powerful. The second future is ambiguity. No invasion. No formal annexation. But pressure remains. Appointments, statements, signals. Greenland lives in uncertainty. Europe adapts. Norms weaken quietly. This is the most likely path because it avoids confrontation while still asserting dominance. The third future is rupture. Force is used or seriously threatened. NATO fractures. The principle of collective defense collapses. Small states everywhere learn a brutal lesson. Protection depends on power, not promises. That world is less stable, more fearful, and far harder to control. History teaches us something important. International order is not permanent. It is maintained, and when maintenance stops, decline accelerates. The choice ahead is not abstract. It is immediate, which brings us to the final question. What should we learn from this moment? Moments like this reveal the truth. Not about Greenland, but about the world we live in. For decades, order was built on a simple promise. That power would be constrained. That borders would matter. That alliances would protect the small. That promise is now being tested. Not by enemies, but from within. Greenland forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Rules survive only when the powerful choose to obey them. When they don't, law becomes language, and power becomes policy. This is not the end of the international order, but it is a warning, because history does not collapse suddenly. It erodes, then it breaks. What happens next depends on attention, on pressure, on whether people still care. If this analysis helped you see the world more clearly, share it, talk about it, question it, because the future of global order will not be decided in silence. And this will not be the last test. The Arctic is only the beginning. Stay with me.